Hello there, and welcome back to Calm Science Sleep. I'm Jeffrey. Before we begin tonight, let me ask you something. What do you think Earth looked like before there was a single dinosaur footprint anywhere on it? Before green leaves, before eyes, before bones, before anything with a face at all? Most of us picture prehistory as a world of towering reptiles and thundering footsteps, but that's really just the most recent chapter of a much older story. Tonight, we're going to travel far past that chapter, back through nearly 4 billion years of quiet, patient transformation into an Earth that would be almost unrecognizable to us. A molten world becoming a rocky one, a world with no oxygen to breathe, a world frozen edge to edge in ice, and a world that slowly learned how to grow living things. There are no roars in this story, no towering shadows across the plain, just chemistry, time, and the slow hum of a planet finding its way toward life. So if you're already tired, that's perfect. Let your body settle into whatever you're resting on. Let your eyelids grow heavy, and let your thoughts loosen their grip on the day behind you. There's nothing you need to remember from tonight. You only need to listen, drift, and let the story carry you gently backward through deep time. If stories like this help you unwind, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. Now, let's slip quietly past the age of dinosaurs and keep going, back, to the very beginning. In the beginning, Earth was not a place you would recognize as a planet at all. It was a churning sphere of molten rock, roughly 4.6 billion years ago, glowing dull red and orange as it pulled itself together from the swirling debris left over after the sun ignited. There was no solid ground to stand on, only oceans of liquid stone, bubbling and shifting beneath skies thick with ash and steam. Gravity slowly gathered the scattered material of the early solar system into a single sphere, and as it did, the collisions of smaller bodies crashing into this newborn world kept its surface in a constant, molten state. It would be hundreds of millions of years before anything resembling a crust could form. This earliest chapter of Earth's history is called the Hadean, named for the underworld, because scientists imagining this era pictured something closer to a landscape from a nightmare than a home. And yet, from this fire, everything that would ever exist here, every ocean, every mountain, every living thing, was slowly beginning to take shape. Not long after Earth began to cool into something resembling a planet, it survived a collision so violent, it's a wonder anything remained at all. Roughly 4.5 billion years ago, a Mars-sized body, sometimes called Theia, is thought to have slammed into the young Earth at an angle, in an impact so immense it liquefied much of both worlds. Enormous amounts of debris were blasted into orbit, a glowing ring of molten rock and vapor circling the wounded planet. Over time, this ring of material began to draw together under its own gravity, cooling and compacting, until it formed a single companion in the sky, the moon. It's a strange thing to consider on a quiet night, that the moon above you was once a searing ring of debris torn from Earth's own body. Some scientists believe this collision also tilted Earth's axis, setting the stage for the seasons that would one day guide the rhythms of every living thing that would call this planet home. For a long stretch after that, Earth entered a period sometimes called the Late Heavy Bombardment, when comets and asteroids continued to rain down from the debris still lingering in the young solar system. Craters formed and reformed as impact after impact struck the cooling crust, some large enough to melt rock instantly, others small enough to simply pepper the surface with scars. Scientists have found evidence of this violent age preserved in ancient lunar rock, since the moon, without an atmosphere or weather to erode its surface, still bears the pockmarks of that era untouched. Earth would have looked similar once, though its own scars have long since been buried, folded, and reshaped by billions of years of geological change. It's strange to think that the serene face of the moon we glimpse through a window at night is really a frozen photograph of Earth's own violent adolescence, still visible after all this time. It might surprise you to learn that we have direct physical evidence from this ancient, fiery age. Tiny crystals no larger than a grain of sand. In the remote Jack Hills of Western Australia, geologists have found zircon crystals dated to more than 4.4 billion years old, making them the oldest known fragments of Earth's crust. In the early 2000s, a geologist named John Valley examined the chemical signatures locked inside these microscopic crystals and found something remarkable. Traces suggesting that liquid water may have already existed on Earth's surface far earlier than anyone expected, perhaps within only a couple 100 million years of the planet's formation. It's a strange kind of quiet wonder, holding proof that this violent, molten world was already beginning to cool and gather oceans long before life, or even solid continents, had truly taken hold. Those tiny crystals have outlasted mountains, oceans, and entire ancient landscapes, quietly carrying the memory of Earth's very first chapter. As the bombardment slowed and Earth's surface began to cool further, water condensed out of the thick, steaming atmosphere in a rain that some scientists believe may have lasted on and off for thousands of years. The clouds above the young planet would have been dense with vapor released from volcanic activity and delivered by icy comets. And as temperatures dropped low enough, that vapor began to fall. Not in gentle showers, but in a relentless downpour that filled the low basins of the crust and gave rise to the very first oceans. There would have been no life yet to witness it, no shoreline, no waves lapping against sand, just the steady, patient work of water, finding its way into every crevice of a still-forming world. It's a strange kind of ancestor to imagine, a rain that fell for what may have been millennia, quietly building the ocean that would one day cradle everything alive. Once liquid water pooled across the surface, Earth possessed one of the essential ingredients for life. But the recipe for turning simple chemistry into something living remained, and still remains, deeply mysterious. In 1953, a young graduate student named Stanley Miller, working with his advisor Harold Urey at the University of Chicago, tried to recreate the conditions of early Earth in a glass apparatus in his laboratory. He filled it with water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, meant to mimic the primitive atmosphere, then sent electric sparks through the mixture to simulate lightning. Within just a week, the water inside had turned a cloudy pink, and when Miller analyzed it, he found amino acids, the basic building blocks of proteins, had formed spontaneously from nothing but simple gases and electricity. It didn't create life, but it showed, for the first time, that the chemistry of life could arise from the raw ingredients of a young, lifeless planet. Somewhere in oceans, much like the one Miller tried to imitate, that same kind of quiet chemistry was unfolding for real, patiently, invisibly, across millions of years. The atmosphere hovering above those earliest oceans would have been almost unrecognizable to us and utterly unbreathable. It held little or no oxygen, but was rich instead in gases like methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, likely giving the sky a strange hazy orange tint rather than the blue we know today. Sunlight filtering through that thick chemical soup would have cast the world in a dim amber glow, more like standing inside a dense fog lit by a distant lamp than a bright, clear day. This early atmosphere, sometimes called a reducing atmosphere because it lacked free oxygen, was in some ways more hospitable to the earliest chemistry of life than our modern air would be, since the delicate organic molecules forming in the ocean would have been quickly destroyed by oxygen's reactive nature. It's an odd thought that the very air we depend on today would have been toxic to the tender first sparks of biology, and that life needed a poisonless, oxygen-free world in order to begin at all. Deep beneath the waves of that early dim ocean, another possible cradle for life was quietly simmering. Hydrothermal vents, cracks in the seafloor, where mineral-rich water heated by the planet's molten interior spews upward into the cold ocean above, may have provided the perfect conditions for the earliest chemical reactions of life. Around these vents, chemical energy pours out in a way not unlike a slow, steady furnace. And some scientists believe the mineral structures found there, riddled with tiny natural compartments, could have acted like microscopic incubators, concentrating simple molecules until they began linking into longer, more complex chains. Even today, hydrothermal vents host thriving ecosystems that never see a single ray of sunlight, drawing all their energy instead from the Earth's own inner heat. It's a strange and beautiful possibility that our story may not have begun bathed in light at all, but in darkness, warmth, and the quiet mineral hum of the ocean floor. However it began, life on Earth left its earliest confirmed fingerprints not as dramatic fossils of creatures, but as strange layered mounds of rock called stromatolites. These formations are built up slowly, one microscopic layer at a time, by colonies of ancient microbes trapping sediment and minerals as they went about their quiet business of survival. Some of the oldest stromatolite fossils found in Western Australia date back roughly 3.5 billion years, making them among the earliest direct evidence of life on our planet. Remarkably, living stromatolites still exist today in a handful of places, most famously in the shallow, salty waters of Shark Bay, Australia, where visitors can walk along boardwalks and look down at structures that are, in essence, living relatives of some of the very first life forms to ever exist. Standing before them is a bit like standing at the edge of deep time itself, watching a process that has continued, largely unchanged, for more than 3 billion years. Among the tiny organisms responsible for building those ancient stromatolites were cyanobacteria, humble microbes that would go on to change the entire trajectory of life on Earth. These organisms discovered how to perform photosynthesis, capturing sunlight and using it to convert water and carbon dioxide into energy, releasing oxygen as a byproduct along the way. At first, this new invention had barely any effect on the wider world. The oxygen these microbes released was quickly absorbed by iron dissolved in the oceans and by minerals in the rocks, leaving little trace in the atmosphere itself. But cyanobacteria continued their slow work for hundreds of millions of years, patiently exhaling oxygen into an ocean that could only soak up so much before it began, finally, to seep upward into the sky. It's easy to overlook something so small, a single-celled organism drifting quietly in ancient water, but these tiny beings were, in a very real sense, terraforming the entire planet, one bubble of oxygen at a time. Eventually, the oceans could not absorb any more oxygen, and it began spilling into the atmosphere in what geologists now call the Great Oxidation Event, occurring roughly 2.4 billion years ago. For the countless anaerobic organisms that had thrived in Earth's oxygen-free environment up to that point, this new gas was nothing short of poison, and many of them were wiped out in what may have been the first mass extinction in Earth's history, though it unfolded far too slowly and quietly for anyone to have witnessed it as a single event. Scientists first pieced together evidence for this ancient catastrophe through something called banded iron formations, striking layers of rust-colored rock found around the world, alternating between iron-rich and iron-poor bands, records of the ocean's iron reacting with the newly available oxygen before it could accumulate in the air. A geologist named Preston Cloud was among the first in the 1960s and 70s to piece together this story from the rock itself, writing in those quiet iron stripes the record of a planet learning to breathe for the very first time, at the cost of nearly everything that had lived there before. For those organisms that could adapt to this new, oxygen-rich world, however, extraordinary possibilities opened up. Oxygen allowed for far more efficient energy production than the older anaerobic pathways ever could, and this abundance of energy is thought to have paved the way for more complex forms of life to eventually emerge. It's a pattern that would repeat again and again throughout Earth's history. Catastrophe followed by opportunity, extinction followed by invention, as though the planet itself were slowly, painfully, learning how to build something greater out of the wreckage of what came before. The Great Oxidation Event stands as one of the earliest and starkest examples of this rhythm, a reminder that even the very air we now breathe so easily was, at one point, the cause of the world's first great dying. As if the introduction of oxygen weren't dramatic enough, that same gas may have helped trigger one of the strangest and most extreme periods in Earth's entire history, an age when the planet is believed to have frozen almost entirely solid. Sometime between roughly 720 and 635 million years ago, during a stretch of time called the Cryogenian period, evidence suggests that glaciers crept all the way from the poles to the equator, encasing the oceans themselves in thick sheets of ice. This idea, now known as Snowball Earth, was significantly developed by a geologist named Joseph Kirschvink, who coined the term in 1992 after studying magnetic evidence in ancient rocks that suggested glacial deposits had once formed near the equator, a location that should have been far too warm for ice under normal conditions. A few years later, another geologist, Paul Hoffman, traveled to the remote landscapes of Namibia to study rock formations firsthand, and returned convinced that the evidence for a truly global freeze was undeniable. Layers of glacial debris directly overlain by carbonate rocks that typically only form in warm water, suggesting a planet that swung wildly between deep freeze and sudden thaw. If Snowball Earth truly happened, it would have been a world almost too strange to imagine. An ocean sealed beneath ice, possibly more than a kilometer thick in places, sunlight barely able to penetrate to the water below, and the entire planet locked in a silence far more profound than any winter we've ever known. Life, remarkably, appears to have survived this ordeal, likely clinging on in small pockets of liquid water near volcanic vents, or in thin cracks in the ice where little sunlight could still filter through. Some scientists believe these extreme, repeated freezes may have actually helped drive the evolution of more complex life, forcing surviving organisms into new evolutionary pathways once the ice finally began to retreat. The planet would have thawed dramatically as volcanic carbon dioxide, unable to escape into a frozen ocean, built up in the atmosphere over millions of years until it triggered an intense greenhouse effect, melting the ice in what may have been a surprisingly rapid transformation on a geological timescale. From the depths of a frozen world, Earth rebounded into something new, setting the stage for one of the great turning points in the story of life. While the ice came and went, the very ground beneath it was also undergoing its own slow transformation. Earth's first true continents, small, stable cores of ancient rock called cratons, had begun forming billions of years earlier, welded together from volcanic island arcs and solidified magma deep within the crust. Over unimaginable stretches of time, these fragments drifted, collided, and merged, driven by the same tectonic forces that continue to reshape our world today. Some of the oldest surviving fragments of continental crust can still be found today in places like the Canadian Shield, the Pilbara region of Australia, and parts of South Africa. Ancient rock that has somehow endured, weathered, and folded across billions of years, without ever being fully recycled back into the Earth's molten interior. Standing on those ancient outcrops today, a person is quite literally standing on some of the very first solid ground this planet ever produced, rock that predates almost every other feature we consider permanent, older than mountains, older than oceans as we know their shapes, older by far than any bone or shell. The engine driving all of this slow continental wandering, plate tectonics, is one of Earth's most defining and least understood features. Scientists still debate exactly when and how this process began, but its effects on the deep history of our planet are impossible to overstate. As tectonic plates shifted and collided, they built and destroyed mountain ranges, opened and closed ocean basins, and constantly recycled minerals and elements between the crust and the deep mantle below. This slow churning likely played a critical role in stabilizing Earth's climate over immense timescales, drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through the weathering of rock, then releasing it back through volcanic activity in a delicate, planet-scale balancing act. Without this restless shifting of the ground beneath our feet, some scientists believe Earth may never have developed the stable, temperate conditions that eventually allowed complex life to flourish. It's a strange kind of dance, entire continents inching along at the pace of a fingernail's growth, yet through that near imperceptible motion, shaping the very possibility of life above. After the drama of the Great Oxidation Event and the icy extremes of the Cryogenian, Earth entered a strange and remarkably calm stretch of time that some geologists have nicknamed the Boring Billion, spanning roughly from 1.8 billion to 800 million years ago. Compared to the dramatic transformations before and after it, this era appears, at least on the surface, to have been a period of relative stability. Oxygen levels held fairly steady, continents drifted without any catastrophic upheavals, and life, while present, seemed to tread water rather than leap forward in complexity. Yet even quiet stretches of Earth's history carry their own quiet importance, and many scientists now believe this era was anything but idle beneath the surface. It may have been during this long calm that some of the most important evolutionary innovations of all time were slowly, invisibly taking shape. Biology working patiently in the background before its next great transformation. One of the most important of these hidden innovations may have been the emergence of a completely new kind of cell. For most of Earth's early history, life consisted only of simple cells without a nucleus, called prokaryotes, similar to modern bacteria. But at some point, likely more than 1.5 billion years ago, a far more complex kind of cell began to appear. The eukaryote, complete with a nucleus and specialized internal structures. One of the most compelling explanations for how this happened is called the endosymbiotic theory, first seriously proposed by the biologist Lynn Margulis in the late 1960s. She suggested that certain structures within complex cells, particularly mitochondria, the energy-producing powerhouses of the cell, were once free-living bacteria that were engulfed by a larger cell and, rather than being digested, formed a permanent, mutually beneficial partnership. Margulis's paper was famously rejected by more than a dozen scientific journals before it was finally published, considered too radical an idea at the time. Today, it stands as one of the most important insights in the history of biology, a reminder that even our own cells carry the memory of an ancient partnership formed deep in Earth's quiet, patient past. This new kind of cell, more complex, more capable, and able to support far more intricate internal machinery, eventually opened the door to something Earth had never seen before: organisms made of more than one cell working together. Multicellularity appears to have evolved independently many different times throughout Earth's history, in different lineages, at different points, suggesting it wasn't quite as difficult a leap as it might seem. Single-celled organisms began clustering together, then specializing, some cells handling one task, others handling another, until true, coordinated multicellular life began to take shape. It's a small transition in a sentence, but an enormous one in practice. The shift from a single self-sufficient cell to a community of cells depending on one another, each giving up a measure of independence for the greater strength of the whole. In many ways, this shift laid the foundation for every visible living thing that would ever follow. Every leaf, every shell, every creature that would one day walk, swim, or fly across this planet. As multicellular life slowly took hold, Earth's oceans began to host organisms unlike anything that had come before, and unlike almost anything that would come after. In 1946, a geologist named Reg Sprigg was exploring the Ediacara Hills of South Australia when he stumbled upon strange fossil impressions in the ancient sandstone, faint imprints of soft-bodied creatures that seem to defy easy classification. At first, these fossils were dismissed by some as simple mineral formations, or even misidentified as much younger than they truly were. But further study revealed them to be genuine remnants of life dating back more than 550 million years, from a period now known as the Ediacaran. The creatures preserved there looked like nothing alive today: quilted, ribbed, frond-like forms with no clear heads, no eyes, no limbs, some resembling flattened leaves, others like strange stitched cushions, resting gently on the ancient seafloor. Among the strangest of these creatures was Dickinsonia, an oval, ribbed organism that could grow to more than a meter across, yet remains something of a mystery even today, since scientists still debate exactly how it moved, fed, or where it fits on the tree of life. Alongside it drifted creatures like Charnia, a tall, frond-shaped organism anchored to the seafloor, swaying gently, more reminiscent of a fern or a feather than any animal we'd recognize. These Ediacaran organisms lived in a world without predators as we understand them, a strange, peaceful ecosystem sometimes referred to as the Garden of Ediacara, where soft, slow-moving life forms could exist without fear of being hunted, torn apart, or consumed. It's a gentle, almost dreamlike image to hold on to. An ancient ocean floor covered in quilted, frond-like beings, swaying together in the dim current, untouched by claws or teeth, resting quietly in the deep hush of a world still learning how to be alive. That peaceful garden, however, would not last forever. As oxygen levels in the oceans and atmosphere continued their slow climb, and as evolution continued its patient tinkering, life was quietly building toward one of the most extraordinary bursts of innovation in the planet's entire history. Around 541 million years ago, in a relatively short span of geological time, an explosion of biological diversity occurred so rapid and so dramatic that it's simply called the Cambrian explosion. In what may have been just a few tens of millions of years, the blink of an eye by Earth's standards, nearly every major group of animals alive today, and many that have long since vanished, appeared in the fossil record for the first time. Hard shells, complex eyes, jointed limbs, and predatory behavior all emerged rapidly, transforming that gentle, quilted Ediacaran seafloor into something closer to the animal kingdom we might recognize, a place of hunters and hunted, armor and speed for the very first time. Some of our clearest window into this astonishing burst of early animal life comes from a single remarkable fossil site high in the Canadian Rockies. In 1909, the American paleontologist Charles Doolittle Walcott was riding along a mountain trail in British Columbia when, according to the story passed down through generations of scientists, his horse slipped on a loose rock, revealing a slab of shale beneath containing extraordinarily well-preserved fossils. This discovery became known as the Burgess Shale, and it remains one of the most important fossil deposits ever found, preserving not just the hard shells of ancient sea creatures, but their soft tissues too. Delicate gills, eyes, and internal structures typically lost entirely to time. Walcott spent years excavating the site, uncovering bizarre creatures like Opabinia, with its 5 eyes and a long, flexible claw where a mouth might be expected, and Anomalocaris, a fearsome, meter-long predator that would have been the largest animal alive at the time. These strange forms, some so unusual that scientists initially struggled to classify them at all, gave us our first true glimpse into just how experimental, chaotic, and inventive that early explosion of animal life really was. Among the many new inventions to emerge from this burst of evolutionary creativity, few would prove as important or as enduring as the trilobite. These armored, segmented creatures, distant relatives of modern insects and crabs, would go on to dominate the world's oceans for hundreds of millions of years, evolving into thousands of different species, from tiny forms barely visible to the eye to others as long as a human forearm. Trilobites are so numerous and well preserved in the fossil record that they've become one of the most studied groups of extinct animals in the world, offering paleontologists an extraordinarily detailed timeline of evolutionary change across an immense stretch of Earth's history. Some trilobite species even evolved complex compound eyes made of natural calcite crystal, granting them some of the most advanced vision of their era. It's a small kind of miracle that these humble, crawling creatures, once so common, they blanketed the seafloor by the countless millions, left behind such a rich and detailed record that we can trace their slow transformation across hundreds of millions of years, long after the last living trilobite disappeared. Vision itself, in fact, appears to have been one of the true turning points of this ancient age. Before the Cambrian, most life forms had little need for eyes, drifting or anchored in a world without much active hunting or fleeing. But as predators like Anomalocaris began to emerge, the evolutionary pressure to see and to avoid being seen intensified dramatically. Some scientists have proposed what's sometimes called the light switch theory, the idea that the sudden evolutionary advantage of vision may have helped trigger the rapid diversification of the Cambrian explosion itself, as the ability to detect predators or prey created an evolutionary arms race unlike anything the world had seen before. Eyes evolved independently many different times throughout this period, in many different forms. Simple, light-sensitive patches, clusters of lenses, compound structures built from hundreds of individual units. It's a strange thought that something as fundamental as sight, something most of us rely on every waking moment without a second thought, may have first flickered into existence in the dim currents of an ancient sea, sparked by the simple, urgent need to see danger coming. As the Cambrian gave way to the following period, known as the Ordovician, life in the oceans continued its rapid diversification, filling ecological niches that had never existed before. It was during this time that the first true fish began to appear, jawless at first, with simple sucking mouths rather than the biting jaws we associate with fish today. These early vertebrates, creatures like Arandaspis, represent an enormously important branch on the tree of life, the first stirrings of the lineage that would, hundreds of millions of years later, eventually lead to every fish, amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammal that has ever lived, including us. The oceans of the Ordovician teemed with an extraordinary variety of life: coral reefs built by ancient organisms, enormous predatory nautiloids with long conical shells, and vast fields of crinoids, delicate creatures related to starfish that looked more like flowering plants than animals, swaying gently on long stalks across the ancient seafloor. While the oceans flourished, the land above remained largely barren, a stark and silent landscape of bare rock with little more than a thin film of microbial life clinging to damp surfaces near the shore. But high above, invisible and easily overlooked, something crucial was slowly taking shape in the atmosphere. As oxygen levels continued their long climb, some of that oxygen began reacting with sunlight high in the upper atmosphere, gradually forming a protective layer of ozone. This layer would prove essential to the next great chapter of life's story, since it began to filter out much of the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation that had previously made any sustained life on land essentially impossible. Slowly, this invisible shield thickened above the empty, rocky continents, preparing the way, quite unknowingly, for life to finally attempt what it had never done before, to leave the water behind. The very first pioneers to make that leap were remarkably humble. Around 470 million years ago, simple plants resembling modern mosses and liverworts began creeping across damp coastal rocks, requiring no roots, no stems, nothing but a thin film of moisture to survive. Over the following tens of millions of years, plants slowly grew more sophisticated, developing simple vascular tissues capable of transporting water upward, allowing them to grow taller and colonize drier ground further from any shoreline. Among the earliest of these vascular plants was a tiny, leafless organism called Cooksonia, standing only a few centimeters tall, with simple branching stems topped by small round structures that released spores into the wind. It hardly looks impressive compared to the plants we know today, barely more than a few stiff green threads reaching up from the barren rock. But Cooksonia and its relatives represent one of the most important transitions in the entire history of life, the first tentative, fragile foothold of complex life upon dry land. Once plants gained a secure foothold, they transformed the world above the waterline with startling speed, at least by geological standards. By the time of the Devonian period, roughly 385 million years ago, the first true forests had begun to rise from ground that had been bare rock only 100 million years before. In 1870, quarry workers in Gilboa, New York, stumbled upon strange fossilized tree stumps while digging, and for decades, scientists puzzled over exactly what kind of ancient plant they belonged to. It wasn't until much later, excavation and careful reconstruction, that researchers realized these fossils belonged to an ancient tree called Eospermatopterus, part of what's now recognized as the world's oldest known forest, a woodland of tall, fern-like trees crowned with frond-like branches, rising from soil that, until recently in geological terms, had never supported anything taller than a few centimeters. Standing among the reconstructed models of these ancient trees today, it's easy to imagine the profound quiet of that first forest, sunlight filtering down through fronds unlike any living plant, the ground below still bare of grass, still empty of birdsong, holding only the ancient hush of wind through some of the very first trees the world had ever known. As forests spread and diversified, so too did the life sheltering beneath them. Insects, among the very first animals to conquer land alongside the plants, had already begun exploring this new terrestrial world, evolving into a wide variety of early forms. But the oceans still held most of the planet's animal diversity, and it was there, in the shallow coastal waters of the Devonian, that one of the most consequential transitions in the history of life was quietly taking shape. Certain lobe-finned fish, creatures with sturdy, muscular fins supported by bones remarkably similar in structure to a limb, began spending increasing amounts of time in shallow, oxygen-poor waters, perhaps using their fins to push through mud or briefly prop themselves up. Over many generations, natural selection began favoring individuals with stronger, more limb-like fins, capable of navigating these challenging shallow environments more effectively. In 2004, a team of paleontologists led by Neil Shubin traveled to the remote, icy terrain of Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic, searching specifically for fossils from this critical transitional period. After years of careful searching through exposed rock layers once part of an ancient river delta, they uncovered the fossilized remains of a creature that would become one of the most celebrated discoveries in the history of paleontology, Tiktaalik. This remarkable animal possessed a flattened head, a mobile neck, and strong, bony fins capable of supporting its weight, an almost perfect intermediate form between fish and the earliest four-limbed animals, or tetrapods. Tiktaalik couldn't fully walk on land, but it could likely prop itself up in shallow water or briefly navigate muddy banks, representing one of the clearest fossil snapshots we have of life caught in the very act of transition, one fin stroke away from becoming a footstep. From these early experiments in shallow water, true tetrapods soon emerged, four-limbed animals capable of moving, however awkwardly, across dry land for the first time. This transition opened an entirely new world to animal life, one without the buoyancy of water to support their bodies, and without the constant threat of drowning, but full of entirely new challenges, breathing air directly, supporting their own weight against gravity, and finding food in a landscape only recently colonized by plants and insects. It's a strange thing to consider that every four-limbed creature alive today, every frog, every lizard, every bird, every dog curled up asleep somewhere right now, and every single one of us traces our body plan back to these humble, awkward pioneers, dragging themselves through ancient Devonian mud with fins not yet fully evolved into legs, following the plants and insects that had already shown the way onto land. As life continued its slow migration onto solid ground, Earth entered the Carboniferous period, roughly 359 million years ago, an age defined by vast, humid swamps and forests unlike anything before or since. Oxygen levels during this era climbed to some of the highest concentrations in Earth's entire history, potentially reaching over 30% of the atmosphere, compared to about 21% today. This oxygen-rich air, combined with a warm, swampy climate, allowed certain animals to grow to truly extraordinary sizes. Dragonflies with wingspans over 70 centimeters, nearly the length of your arm, glided through those dense, humid forests, while millipede-like creatures called Arthropleura grew to more than 2 meters long, crawling slowly across the forest floor like living, armored logs. Scientists believe this unusually rich oxygen supply allowed insects, whose bodies rely on simple tubes to distribute oxygen rather than lungs, to grow far larger than would be possible under our modern atmosphere, since more oxygen could diffuse effectively through even a sizable body. It was in these same vast swamp forests that Earth quietly built up one of its most consequential resources. As Carboniferous plants died, they fell into the stagnant, oxygen-poor waters of the swamps, where the fungi and microbes capable of properly decomposing woody material had not yet fully evolved. Layer upon layer of this undecayed plant material accumulated over millions of years, gradually compressed under the weight of new sediment above, slowly transforming into the vast coal deposits that would, hundreds of millions of years later, power much of human civilization's industrial age. It's an almost dizzying thought that the coal burned in furnaces and power plants throughout much of recent human history began as leaves and stems in ancient swamp forests, patiently pressed and transformed across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, waiting quietly underground until we finally arrived to dig it back up. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian period, roughly 299 million years ago, Earth's continents, which had been slowly drifting and colliding for hundreds of millions of years, finally merged into a single, enormous landmass called Pangaea. The supercontinent stretched from pole to pole, surrounded by a single vast global ocean, sometimes called Panthalassa. The interior of this massive continent would have been a place of extremes, since a landmass so large and so far from any coastline experiences far less moderating influence from ocean moisture, likely creating vast, arid deserts stretching for thousands of kilometers across its center. Along the coastlines, however, life continued to flourish and diversify, and it was during this period that the ancestors of reptiles and the ancestors of mammals began to diverge along two very different evolutionary paths, setting the stage, quite unknowingly, for two of the most consequential animal lineages the planet would ever produce. Among the creatures that emerged during this era were the synapsids, sometimes casually, if a little inaccurately, called mammal-like reptiles, since they represent the earliest branch of the lineage that would eventually lead to true mammals many tens of millions of years later. Creatures like Dimetrodon, with its distinctive sail-like structure of skin stretched across tall spines along its back, are often mistaken in popular imagination for dinosaurs, but they actually predate the first true dinosaurs by tens of millions of years, belonging instead to this separate, mammal-related lineage. Scientists believe Dimetrodon's dramatic sail may have helped regulate its body temperature, absorbing or releasing heat as needed in the fluctuating Permian climate, though it may also have played a role in visual displays between individuals. These strange, ancient creatures, walking across a supercontinent under an alien arrangement of stars, represent some of the earliest steps along the long evolutionary road that would, eventually, unbelievably, lead all the way to us. But the flourishing world of the Permian was approaching one of the most catastrophic events in the entire history of life on Earth. Around 252 million years ago, an event so severe it's often simply called the Great Dying brought the Permian period and roughly 90% of all species on Earth to an abrupt and violent end. For years, scientists debated the cause of this almost incomprehensible extinction until researchers began focusing on an enormous region of volcanic rock in Siberia, now known as the Siberian Traps. Evidence gathered from this site suggests that a period of sustained catastrophic volcanic eruptions, potentially lasting for hundreds of thousands of years, released staggering quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, triggering runaway global warming, ocean acidification, and a catastrophic depletion of oxygen throughout the world's oceans. the scale of destruction is almost impossible to properly imagine. Entire ecosystems collapsing across land and sea alike, coral reefs disappearing entirely for millions of years, and forests reduced to barren, eroding landscapes stripped of nearly all their former diversity. In the aftermath of this almost planet-ending catastrophe, the world that emerged was eerily quiet, populated by only a scattered handful of hardy survivors. Among the most successful of these survivors was a small, stocky creature called Lystrosaurus, a distant relative of the mammal-like reptiles that had flourished before the extinction. For reasons scientists still don't fully understand, perhaps its ability to burrow, its resilient physiology, or simply fortunate timing, Lystrosaurus managed to survive the catastrophe when so many other species could not, and in the millions of years that followed, it became remarkably widespread. Its fossils found today on nearly every continent, a humble, unassuming creature quietly dominating a broken, recovering world. It would take millions of years for Earth's ecosystems to fully recover from the devastation of the Great Dying. But recover, they eventually did, slowly rebuilding into new forms, new relationships, and new evolutionary possibilities. It was in this long, patient rebuilding, sometime in the early Triassic period that followed, that a new group of reptiles began to quietly diversify along the margins of the recovering world. Small, agile creatures that would, over the following tens of millions of years, slowly give rise to the first true dinosaurs. But that, gently, is a story for another night, another journey we'll take together, another time you're ready to drift off to sleep. Before we close tonight's journey, it's worth pausing to consider just how strange and vast this entire story truly is, and how relatively recently we came to understand any of it at all. For most of human history, people had no concept of deep time whatsoever, no framework for imagining a past stretching back not thousands, but billions of years. It was a Scottish farmer and naturalist named James Hutton who, in the late 1700s, first began to seriously challenge this narrow view of Earth's age. Standing at a rocky outcrop called Sicker Point along the Scottish coast in 1788, Hutton observed layers of rock tilted vertically, buried beneath other layers lying perfectly horizontal above them, evidence, he realized, of an almost unimaginable span of time required to tilt, erode, and rebury such formations. Gazing at that quiet cliff face, Hutton is said to have remarked that he found, in the layers before him, no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end, a phrase that would come to represent one of the most profound shifts in how humanity understood its own planet. It took nearly 2 more centuries of careful, patient scientific work, geologists, chemists, biologists, each adding their own small piece, before the story we've traveled through tonight could even begin to be pieced together at all. And so, as our journey through this ancient world draws quietly to a close, consider everything that had to happen, patiently, invisibly, across billions upon billions of years, simply for this moment to exist at all. A molten world had to cool. Water had to fall from the sky for what may have been thousands of years. Tiny microbes had to learn, through nothing but chemistry and time, how to breathe in sunlight and exhale the very air that fills your lungs right now. Oceans had to freeze entirely solid and then thaw. Cells had to learn to work together. Strange quilted creatures had to sway gently on an ancient seafloor before giving way to shells and claws and eyes. Fish had to become brave enough, or perhaps simply desperate enough, to drag themselves onto muddy shorelines. Forests had to rise from bare rock, and an entire world had to nearly die, not once, but many times, before finally, slowly, rebuilding itself into something new each time. You are, in a very real sense, the product of every single one of these ancient, patient transformations, carrying within your own body the quiet legacy of oceans, ice ages, extinctions, and slow, relentless invention. The calcium resting quietly in your bones and the oxygen filling your lungs with every breath are both, in their own way, gifts from creatures and events unimaginably older than any human memory could ever reach. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might imagine yourself resting gently above all of that vast ancient history, above the molten rock, above the frozen oceans, above the quiet, swaying gardens of the Ediacaran, above the first fragile forests reaching up toward a sky that had, at last, finally, patiently, become breathable. There's nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. Let the layers of this ancient story settle quietly around you, like sediment gently drifting down through calm, still water, one soft layer resting upon another, across a time too vast to fully hold in your mind, but gentle enough, I hope, to hold you now toward rest. If this quiet journey through deep time helped you unwind this evening, consider liking this video and subscribing to Calm Science Sleep, so more stories like this one can find their way to you. There's always another chapter waiting, another quiet corner of ancient time still left to explore. For now, though, let your thoughts grow soft, let your breathing slow, and let yourself rest as easily and as patiently as this old world once learned to breathe. Good night, and sleep well.